My practice is very, very broad. It takes in a lot of different mediums and methods, but I've kind of driven a stake into the kind of heart of where drawing and paper sit in the practice, and then spread out from there and tried to kind of sort of weave a route through the practice. So it's sometimes less important to explain what the work is. I'm just using it to kind of illustrate something, and at other times it's maybe a bit more important. So you'll see as we kind of go on. I've also split it into themes. For me, drawing and thinking are completely joined. They are a way of me excavating ideas for a practice. There are lots of different ways that I draw, and you'll see from the early drawings how they are more, they happen earlier in the way that a work comes together, and then later they become their own language. So they lift away from the page or the paper, and they also kind of go into things like sound and video. So they kind of lift away from the paper surface. So the themes to the practice are inversion and gravity, and reversal, and performance and kind of compression, but we'll kind of come to that. So I just thought I'd show you a little bit. We're going to dovetail sculpture against drawing. Okay, I'm going to move quite quickly. So this is a work from 1995, which took nearly 2 years to make, where I dug underground a long chamber. And it's in here to kind of illustrate that that was a very unusual place to make a work. I've always looked for different kinds of sites to make work. It's not always in the gallery space. And I was looking for a standalone kind of place to make work. And some things happened here which were really important for the drawing. And whilst working underground, if we were to go underneath this floor by a metre, you would start to hear sounds from above. You hear the sounds of the street, you hear footprints, you hear people talking. So I started to think about the ceiling as a place to make sculpture rather than the floor. And that completely turned upside down our idea and notions of sculpture itself, because it's something that's always dependent on gravity and sits on the floor. So it got me into quite a different area of working. Just to kind of show you what type of drawing I was doing before and during the making of that piece. This is something I did at college. I did a lot of still life drawing, trying to kind of think about changing the ideas in the work. So they were still lives which rooted me in the act of faithfully drawing what was in front of me. But I was trying to think about some of the ideas in the world around. So this drawing, which is importantly called Spade Casting a Shadow Like a Mine Shaft, I was looking at the shadow more than the actual object itself, and thinking about that in relation to sculpture and digging into the ground. This turning upside down, so the ceiling becoming an important space, also led to the changing of the surface on what I drew on. So I started to draw on blackboards, so white onto black rather than black onto white. And the blackboard became an important surface to have with me or close by. During this time as well, the video pieces started, and this is probably the first piece that was shown in Holland of a video piece, thinking about video as sculpture. The kinds of drawings in the sketchbooks were like this, and I've mentioned before about the ceiling being an important space. I was also thinking about the surface of the earth as a mirror, so around which things can be mirrored, or what was above is also below. So if you dig a hole, the earth that comes out of the hole ends up being above the earth. It's very, very simple kind of ideas, but they're important to the work. This installation called Matrix was a kind of turning point in video and sculpture for me, where there were 20 televisions bolted to the ceiling with a different image on each television of the person, me, hanging upside down. So they acted like light bulbs coming down from the ceiling. To do those films at that point, I didn't have access to digital video making, so they were all done on VHS, and each one has a half-an-hour tape, so I had an assistant to bolt me to the ceiling, press play, run it for half an hour, unbolt. There were so many outtakes, it was kind of ridiculous, but to achieve that work is the only way at that time to do it. So the performance, which also comes very much into the drawing, is very seldom seen by an audience. There is performance embedded in both the drawing and in the work itself, but those things are mediated either through a video or the drawing itself. You don't actually go and witness that as an audience usually. Okay, so it's a bigger picture of the installation. All the time I'm thinking as a sculptor, I suppose, through materials, so to make material changes with the drawing. So what surfaces and what materials can you make drawings with? I'm sure you've got tons of your own ideas and mediums. This is grease on paper. So importantly, the grease is a liquid, and when it joins to paper, it makes a mark, it stains the paper, and that keeps moving with time. So they're changing forever, actually, and they're very unstable. So in a way, I'm quite resistant to things being permanent and stable. But when it comes to paper, which is a kind of obvious thing to say, and the preservation of those things, I have, I hope, a healthy difficulty with debating whether you should fix something in time or whether time works on it and you allow that to happen. And there's many experts in this room to be able to talk about that, but I think it's an interesting area when it comes to something, material like paper, which you would think it can't last for decades or centuries, but actually it may be the preservation that keeps it for longer than the permanent sculpture that you see on the side of the building made out of bronze, because it gets melted down for wartime or whatever. Okay, a simple upside down sketch, pen and ink and chalk. For a few years in the studio, I had a massive blackboard in the space, and that was another surface. It was kind of like a notice board, and everything that went onto that was thought about for a while. It was kind of ideas based, and then it disappeared. It was rubbed out, and I think that kind of forced ideas into the work in a different way. If you can't keep a hold of something, if you've got something that's going to slip away from you, you have to react to that. Either you keep some of that important information or you erase it. And it was an important part of the studio practice and an important part of the work. no longer have it actually. So this installation of two speakers, which is being held apart on opposing walls of the gallery by two acro props, was a sculpture with sound. So it's the sound of a voice, and in the left-hand speaker, the voice is generated with me hanging upside down from the ceiling, saying, "Let me down." And that creates a kind of compression of the voice. In the opposite speaker is a calmer voice that's with me standing on the ground saying, "Don't let me down." So they're at once held in union with each other, but they're held apart. And those two voices work in opposites to each other. They fight each other, but they're together. Sound comes into the drawing literally, and also through performance and action. Okay, it's just a shot of me recording that. Just some sketches in a sketchbook around the time of making these works. This drawing is made purely thinking about sound. I'm not thinking about form of the drawing in any way. I'm just thinking about sound that makes. This is a double installation, or two-room installation, where one room is completely empty and the other room has a video projected onto a wall, a constructed wall that hangs from the ceiling. This has the sound of a child's lullaby tinkling away, and the next room is, this is completely silent, this room, but it has the action of someone strapped to a bed playing a small lullaby toy. You walk into this room and it has that sound played through the walls of the gallery, so there are no speakers to see, there are just the walls. This drawing was made that year. It's quite different in style immediately, but it helped me think about the kind of spaces, the kind of context for a work in terms of an audience. And I suppose absolutely key to me and to drawing itself is a journey. If it's a journey with a pencil or an oil stick, it could be a journey through a sculpture or an installation. And that, I'm trying to kind of unpack that for the viewer, not me. It's for you, for us as viewers who journey around a work. I find that a very important part of making a work. How that's created, where the fenestrations are in the installation or the work, how that person might walk through a show. And I hope you would consider that too when you're making your own work. It's absolutely key, I think. So these watercolours are quite illustrative of ideas and plans for works. Sometimes, in fact, rather often, drawings are impossible works. I don't think ideas in a sketchbook can always be made into good works. And there's a filtration process in the sketchbooks and the drawings which naturally kind of filter out what you should be making and what is not practicable or going to amount to much when it's done. And somehow the drawing, or to draw that, helps. This inversion video is simply made by the person hanging upside down from the ceiling with a medicine ball, and there's another person shouting, "Drop it." The camera is turned upside down as well, so when it's replayed on a monitor, after some minutes the ball exits up instead of down. So all the while thinking about gravity in relation to the world and also our bodies. One of the things that happens when you hang upside down for a long time is blood goes into your head. I don't know, does anyone do yoga or Pilates or anything like that? Or has anyone had bad back, you go to hospital and hang upside down from the... No. So the blood goes into the head and it compresses the head, so it made me think about that as a space, and a kind of how that maybe psychologically can change what you're thinking about. These drawings are all, there are several tens of these, if not 100 or so of these head drawings. So drawing from looking above someone's head. The materials that I was moving into the drawings at this time were things like iron and salt. One of the things that happens with the sculpture sometimes, and I hope with the drawings more, is that there's a kind of union between the materials that you draw with and the paper surface, rather than something sitting on the paper. So, is there a difference between drawing with pencil, a pencil drawing on paper, or paper with pencil on? I think about that in terms of the union of mark making in relation to paper. Sometimes it happens with concept. So earlier I saw your exhibition, wonderful exhibition, which involves kind of conceptual marking of the paper. It's the ideas are embedded in the actual work itself. You can't separate the two. So the surface of that as paper is absolutely in there with the thinking behind the work and of course the materials and the making of it. And I think I sometimes have difficulty when it's a kind of illustration of an idea where the marks kind of sit on the paper and they're trying to do something which doesn't become a kind of union with the paper itself. So I'm quite interested to talk to you about that actually, particularly in the making of paper. You can think about that during the making of a piece of paper, and that's something I haven't done actually. So there's a drawing up there of something breaking through the surface of the paper. I don't know who's made that drawing on the wall. The paper there.
Yeah, was the first year.
Okay, so it's kind of, it's embedded in the actual making of the work. So thinking and drawing, thinking and paper, I think, when they become a union. Equally, yours, I've forgotten your name, your grass.
Lionel, yeah.
Sorry?
Lionel.
Your pieces. The ideas are embedded in the work itself, in the making of the paper. Still working with video. This was shown at Central Station Metro, Newcastle, 10 years ago. That was up for 6 months, and in the upper console, upstairs, ticketing console, there was a video piece, and there was an upside down plasma hanging and the floor below. Still working with the surface of the earth as a kind of dividing line between what's above and below. Another video piece in Greece where I'm thinking about the framing of the monitor and the making of that work. So thinking about the framing of the drawing, and maybe that the drawing breaks out of the frame. How do we come to decide whether we position an element in the middle of the paper, or whether it moves off the edge, or whether it strikes right the way through the middle? These are really important decisions, I think, to force, rather than for that to be kind of easy. You have to be, I think, actively engaged with that all the time, because it's too easy to slip into a place where everything ends up in the middle or a comfortable size. Okay, so reversal and reversal. I used to go to wasteland or kind of derelict urban spaces to make drawings, and maybe it's less about the drawing that came out and more about the experience. So I'd sit in the middle of a landscape or a place where there was urban decay and try to pick up the kind of atmosphere of that place. And I'm thinking about that more than the actual drawing. So it took 2 days to make this drawing. That's the result of 2 days spent in that space. But the space was probably more important than the drawing.
How big is that drawing?
About as big as it is on the wall there. No, maybe a bit smaller.
And when you were
2/3
drawing,
of it.
were you flat? Was it flat on the floor or on vertical?
No, it's on an easel actually, or a kind of makeshift easel.
Mm-hmm.
I hate sitting down.
So you were standing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find that more of an inactive position to make work in, to sit actually.
And was that on the plane? Was that on the vertical plane, or was that some angle?
A slight angle.
Mm.
I had it on a bit of wood actually. So another drawing made in a space outside. I'm thinking about the atmosphere of those spaces, whether it's dry, damp, cold, these kinds of things, and they started to creep into the drawing. Thinking about the figure in relation to space. This is an example of what I've been talking about, placing something right in the middle of the paper. I feel awkward about this drawing because there's very little space around it. I can't locate it in any way. It's just about the thing floating in the middle of the paper. And I think another quite sort of lazy drawing in a way, a kind of ink, watercolour and ink, where I've not really forced something through to conclusion, but an illustration of using different mediums. Okay, these drawings that were made in outdoor locations led to a sort of series of work where I would try to think about inside and outside, so that idea of reversing space. This is an exhibition where a room was built on a lawn outside of Jesus College in Cambridge, where it has no floor or ceiling, but the inside is plastered like a room, so it is essentially an interior that's created, so there's white plaster all the way round, and it's only broken by the door that you go in and out of. Okay, so it's constructed out of scaffolding boards. That's 6 metre by 6 metre square and a 3 metre high space. And on the inside, there was a kind of performance. So a few people only the people who were there that day saw it. I didn't determine it to be seen. It was not a performance, but the drawing becomes performative through the action that these marks are made during the performance, where I charcoal a stick and strike the wall to make a deep horizontal charcoal line. And what happened, quite surprisingly, that was up for 4 months or so, and it would rain, and then the sun would come out again, it would rain again. That charcoal mark became blacker and deeper as time went on. It kind of bit into the surface. So this idea of something as impermanent or ephemeral or delicate as charcoal and paper. I think, what happens when you leave paper outside? I don't know. Does it rain? If it rains for a month, does it dissolve? Or when the sun comes out, does it actually dry up again? Is it quite stable, surprisingly stable? Has it been tested? I don't know. That's what I'm interested in. And the plaster, it surprised me what happened to that charcoal and the plaster surface. It stayed, it didn't decay. It might do in 10 years maybe, but for the duration of the show, it gained a kind of strength, and it had that kind of union of the mark where it became part of the work itself. So it became very, very dense and black, and it dripped. So these marks had rain marks to it as well, so that the weather gave more information than I had given at the beginning. This is a little drawing of something which probably could never be made, so it's like an idea of a lead squash court, so something which the shape of which could be changed by playing in it or action, but it's just a little drawing that came up out of the sketchbook. I'll show you. Another sketchbook drawing where I'm trying to work through ideas, so text and writing coming onto the page as well. Sometimes just drawing doesn't work for me. I have to put information down there as well. In Mexico, we made a show for a huge new gallery which was made in a converted supermarket, and we were each given a kind of a name. Each artist was given a kind of name to think about, or an urban space. That was your name, and I had zoo, so that was my name for the show, and I had to make a work in kind of relation to that in some way. That was a kind of theme of the exhibition. A little bit complicated, but this is a kind of extension of the court room that was made for Jesus College's outside space, except this was a wall that you could walk round with a line made across it in charcoal. So these drawings that are on large sheets of paper that are the size of that projection are made through striking the paper with charcoal on a stick. So they are the kind of reverse. They're almost like a photographic negative onto the paper, because the charcoal gets kicked to the outside of the stick, and it disappears from the middle, but it starts being more dense in the middle. So it's kind of does the opposite when it hits the paper. These are drawings that are made with salt and iron dripped onto paper, and they're life size. So those two marks are where the tear ducts hit the paper, and then I've dripped iron and salt. Simply, I don't want to go into detail with this one. the theme of this show is inside out. So I simply took a bed from inside the house that was shown outside of and put it on a lake, floated it outside. How that fits in with the drawing is kind of to do with reversal. This is an earth drawing, I suppose, making a kind of space, a permanent earth work, which is in Darlington, and it marks the birthplace of the Durham ox. I worked with these diggers in order to make a kind of drawing in the earth. A sketch of it. Okay, the only reason this is in here is because it was a show that had a room full of drawings next to it. So it's the start of when sculpture is shown next to drawing, and drawing becomes part of the sculpture and the installation. Before, it's always been separate, and it started to become part of the actual installation process. I said before that actually the journey, the drawing, thinking about drawing and mark making as a journey across a piece of paper is important in terms of people moving through a space, an exhibition space, but it's not often being shown as part of the work itself. So in the room next to the ox, where you can just see some of them starting there on the right, there were 150 drawings which were made by dropping a single drop of ink on a piece of paper and then blowing it so hard till it makes a kind of tree shape, or turning that upside down, making a root shape, or turning it on its side. The drawings became rivers. So it was trees, roots and rivers. So the drawings became like a background landscape in a way for the ox. What's also happening is that the drawings are being made with the contact, with less human contact with the paper, if you like. They're more indexical in a way. They're made by either hitting the paper or dropping something onto it and blowing it across. They're not made with the hand always. They are sometimes, but not always. An aspect of these are sound, drawings that are made thinking about sound. Sound is part of the sculpture and the installation, and I was trying to unpick that and unravel that in the drawing, or through drawing. So there's more whacked kind of surfaces. And these drawings are made with the same process, so charcoal rubbed onto a stick and then the paper is struck. So I'm running across the space and striking the page, trying to find the centre of that page and also the centre of the space, somewhere to make a piece of work.
So any videos of you actually doing that?
Yes, I never show them. I mean, they're there as documentation. Yeah. So I was asked to make a piece in reaction to the millennium, and a number of artists were asked to do works for that millennium change, and I simply glued paper one on top of another to make a stack, and charcoaled a stick 2,000 times and struck the book until it becomes bruised, eaten into. So it took 3 days to make, and it's a small piece, but it's very kind of wounded as an object, and in a way is the first you know, I wish I'd have been able to make a thick piece of paper rather than stick paper together. That's a really ham-fisted thing to do, is just stick loads of paper one on top of another. It would be much better to have a kind of block of paper. So please help in terms of being able to do that. Paper as an object, that surely is something to kind of talk about. When does paper become an object? So the works that are happening, sometime after that, are sound installations in a gallery. So for this space, again, there were two rooms. One had sound in it, but very little else. It had a statue in it, so very like the room we're in, actually. How do you make a work for a space which is already loaded with kind of information like statues in the corner? Well, I had a go and came up with bordering off these statues and fire alarms and hitting a squash ball in the space for a week, coming out with sound recordings of that, also videos, and edited the sound back into an hour-long piece that was played back into the space. So there was sound but no visual in this big space. There was a voice track, and in the room next door there's a column which, again, if that could have been a solid paper column, that for me would have been a lot better, actually. But what I had to do was bind, like a carpet, hundreds of meters of paper. That's 4 meters high, and it obviously cost a lot of money to get that amount of paper together, so that there was a real thickness to this column. So that's, it's 4 meter high column, which has been hit by a charcoal strap hundreds of times. So again, the kind of marks are embedded in the paper column. We're near the end, I think, of these sort of last drawings are ones that are again made. They're drawing sculptures. I don't know what to call them. They're ones where paper is so much part of the material itself as a sculpture. This is 250 sheets of paper, probably the size of the projection, laid down on the floor, and I've charcoaled a stick and tried to find the centre of that paper and whacked a line, and turned that paper over and done it again with the same stick, no new charcoal, until the mark disappears completely. And it goes maybe down 150 sheets, and all that you can see of that, all the evidence you have, is just down the edge where there's charcoal down about 2/3 of the pile. But it's made after an artist, Joseph Boyce, his piece called Snowfall, which is piles of felt over a tree. So it was made in reaction to another artist's work. And this piece, which is actually canvas and not paper, I think I would have preferred it to have been paper, because it would have had a kind of delicacy which I think would have been in keeping with the piece. But it's 8 meters long, it's white canvas which has been stretched over objects, and the sound is a half-an-hour sound piece that goes from bird song to the sound of an engine. It's called Engine Painting #1, and it was the start of a small series of works to do with sound and painting. I've put together a few other artists' work. Some of you may know these works and these artists. So there's about 5 or so more slides. Do people know Alfredo Yar? I think I mentioned him to you once, Sean. Alfredo Yar. I thought it'd be useful to have some of these as a kind of talking point. He was invited to make a show. I think the town is called, no, I'm not sure what the town is called. I think it is Skogul in Sweden. And he did some research into this town. It had no cultural space whatsoever. It never had a cultural space. But they invited this artist to make a public work. And he was very frustrated by the fact that there was nothing to kind of get his teeth into in terms of an existing cultural space. He found out that there was a paper museum, a paper factory, and that it was a big paper producing town, and decided to make a museum out of paper. The factory agreed to provide, or actually he negotiated. He had some funds, and he said, no, I'd like the paper company to pay for the museum. And they built this museum in the top slide out of paper, and got young Swedish artists to put work into that space. And they had a big opening. And as part of the commission, he said that that museum would be there for a time, and then he would come to burn it. And whilst people visited this space and realised that actually it was a great thing to have a cultural space in the town, they resisted that and put a petition together for him not to burn the space. But he went ahead and did it, and they burnt it down, so it came to nothing at the end of it. And a year later, they came back to him and asked him if they could have a kind of cultural, or they would reignite that space, because they missed it so much. So having built something temporary and then burning it down, after a time it was realised, and I think there's something there now which is a kind of central space to the town. I just thought in terms of paper, there's something really interesting kind of statement made in paper. Richard Serra, who you will know, I've just kind of pulled out in terms of his use of drawing in terms of sculpture, I suppose. So nothing seems to be light with Richard Serra. The way he uses paper and oil stick here gives the paper surface a huge weight and authority, even in terms of the space itself. So he places those images, if you want to call them images, in an architectural situation. So the actual paper is causing the architecture to do something different. I think these drawings jump out of the frame. I haven't talked very much about the frame and paper edges, but these drawings actually move out of the frame of their own space. Agnes Martin, how many people, okay, Agnes Martin, just chosen one wonderful piece where the paper, the drawing is kind of in union with the paper. I think there's through the process that she hand draws these grids across the paper, you begin to lose the surface of the paper and it becomes a kind of sculptural piece. There's a great union in her mark making with the paper, and there's a great conceptual arm in those drawings. I think when paper can take that as a as a medium to take kind of concept very, very well. Can someone help me out how to pronounce his name, please? Chao Go Kwang. I don't know how you pronounce it properly. Do people know this artist? He makes work on paper by, well, he does many things actually, but I suppose he's come to become known for his firework drawings. So he does huge pieces, he lays the paper out and he masks off areas. The community sometimes come in to help, and then he places firework and firecrackers over the paper and sets them alight. They don't do this at home or in this studio, you're not allowed to. But I just thought in terms of mark making, burning or working into something is another way to make a mark. And it imbues that paper with a kind of concept. Fireworks in China go back a long, long way.
蔡国强
Chai Ko Chang.
蔡国强
Fantastic, thank you. Brilliant. Carla Black, so she had some work as part of the Turner Prize here at Baltic. Her use of paper, I thought hers was a really engaging installation when it was shown here. But the paper itself, I mean, she thought very much about the journey that we make around the work. But the paper becomes a wall, and it's also a material, and it's a drawing surface. There's some charcoal on it. I really like the lightness of touch that she has in relation to paper. It looks very casual, the way it's draped and placed, but it's if you try to think it differently, I don't think it's possible. I think she's got a very good hand. And just to think about paper in a very different way, in a non-stretched, non-kind of block form, it's quite unruly when it's like that. You know, that's quite light and unruly. I think it's quite difficult. I'm not sure I would be able to deal with paper like that. Sarah Z. So. I think the way I understand her kind of earlier works was that she was struggling with what to make, and she lived up 10 stories of a block of flats, and she chewed some toilet paper, and by the top floor it was moist enough and malleable enough to make an object out of. So this first, it seems to be cited as her kind of early breakthrough installation, where toilet paper is made into 1,000 different shapes and objects. So that has kind of thinking about paper differently. There's a Robert Rauschenberg from a good few years ago, probably, an automobile tyre print. So the kind of idea maybe of paper being endless on a roll, on a continuum. It's often manufactured like that. I've got a few slides of it being manufactured like that. And how do we deal with that as artists? We think about paper just in the usual formats of elephant and A01 and all these kind of sizes, or do we get into the kind of industrial production of paper? So this is Robin Rhodes, I think it's possibly the last, yeah. Robin Rhodes, who, whilst he's not drawing on paper, he's kind of mark making on the street. So he'll make video works often where he is drawing on a blanked out or white wall surface, completely reversing the kind of idea of 3D, 2D in the space. Sometimes the actual images he's making is more real than he himself as an artist, actor. So he's creating kind of a new kind of flattened space with that drawing surface. And then I got very romantic about pictures of factories and mills where paper's made. So there's an East London, I think there's 4 or 5 of these, East London paper factory, and I was really interested by it being close to the water. And of course that's the source which is needed with paper, but we're talking about rolls of paper. For me, I like to think about paper in the bigger picture, if you like. I think about it on industrial or different scales anyway. It's not just the small sheet of A4 that's in front of us. That's a kind of convenient sized kind of use, but just thinking about it in industry on a bigger scale.
What size paper, what width of paper were they making in that factory?
I don't know.
Because presumably it's a continuous linear type of process.
Yeah.
It suggests a very wide.
Well, there's someone standing here.
Gigantic.
But newspapers and things are printed on huge rolls, so how as artists do we, I mean, I think we have to think out of the kind of artist-made papers sometimes into industry, and I think that's exciting to think about that. Yes, there's the handmade elements, but what about the other end of the scale? Or repetition. So this is in there for the kind of repeating handmade that's never the same. Paper is never the same twice. As you make paper by hand, you'll see that more rudely than you do on a kind of industrial process. But I think that's interesting in terms of generating work as well, the uniqueness of each sheet of paper. There's a fire in a factory, paper mill in India, so it's kind of showing the scale of paper having been put out. Okay, that's the last image, burning paper. It's clear. Don't try this at home.
Just say thank you very much.
I hoped I mean, it's exciting for me to kind of pull a thread through a practice. I hope it isn't too dull to see that many images of things and whether they relate or not. I was saying, they did relate directly at some points and not at others. But I'm interested to have what you're doing more than what I'm doing. And I hope this will kind of generate a few ideas about paper. I think it's wonderful to have this as a space. You kind of, by situating this as a space within your university, it then opens up so much more, and you must be experiencing that a lot of things are coming into this room that you maybe didn't expect.
More and more this, over the last few weeks even, this sort of range of different people come into this environment, and sort of conversations I'm having in the studios, I'm really realising that the layers of conversations that are taking place between us. I think we talked about that before, about that there will be some, somebody who's like maybe coming in as an MFA student, and then somebody who's coming in who's had a lot of experience, 20 years experience working as an artist, a first-year student. I'm sure I'm looking at Lizzie and Jill there. I'm sure you begin to sort of sense that there's a growing. It's like kind of a ripple that's starting to come from this space, which I think is like really encouraging and
I think what I like about it, as somebody who visits occasionally, not every day certainly, is the importance of the practical. This feels like a very practical space, obviously, where paper is being made, but the practice of making it, certainly in my case, feeds the ideas. So ideas come as a consequence of making and talking to other people about what they're doing and what they're making, without them, practical craft side of it, some of which is reasonably technical as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think those ideas wouldn't come out. So I think it certainly works for me in that way, Sean.
Recently, so after the paper factory in China, I recently across an artist who using paper is continuous. He make sticky paper together, thousands. They carved it into a sculpture. They put it up on paper.
And are they heads that kind of, so the neck is elongated and draped, I can't remember this
I can't
person's
remember the
name.
guy's name as well. But there's a video showing.
Yeah, I mean none of that was shown here, that aspect of kind of paper sculpture. I mean, if you press that into a kind of Google search, it goes into a kind of, you get all sorts of things, don't you? But yeah, that where the paper actually becomes a kind of form, it's very much working like that.
I mean, one of the things I found interesting, sort of hearing you go through your talk was, it felt as if, by taking something as simple as the medium of paper, the way that you were kind of revisiting ideas with this in mind felt like quite an interesting journey that you'd taken just to give the presentation, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, very much
I think
so.
we can all sort of think about that situation if we take just one thing like something very, very simple, which helps us to kind of revisit our ideas from a fresh perspective. And that, for me, that certainly came across quite strongly in this presentation, as though it was something. You were talking about things in a slightly different way than you had done before, but because of the kind of this very simple starting point.
Yes, you can kind of feel that something is there a lot in your work, but to kind of place it down on the table and then think about your practice in relation to that one thing all the time, kind of going away into it, is quite an interesting thing to do.
Yes, and I was thinking, not to, obviously this is a paper studio, but not to fetishize, so to speak, but paper, that we could do that with any number of aspects of our practice, to take something very simple, and I think it does kind of help to maybe clarify things or to reach in
order
ideas
or very much so. I mean, does anyone do that? Does anyone feel that's possible? I mean, walking might be another thing, walking in relation to your work. It's got to be there a little bit, I think.
Could you talk a little bit about the labour involved in making those whacking pieces? I think in the work I'm making, it's very labour intensive.
Right.
It's that process of doing it and why you do it and how it makes you feel when you do it. As opposed to dreaming up concepts. There are obviously a wide range of media you use.
With your works, is the labour evident there in the piece?
Yeah, I mean, I'm putting substrate, big sheets of acetate out at sea, and you can see texture. It's actually physically putting it out there.
Right.
Leaving it. But that's all my DNA is to do that, being family, being fisherman, cutting things. So I feel happy I do go on doing that, So I'm just
like a ritual.
Yeah, I look at how, if you could talk a little bit about why that's important. The squash ball, that repetition, is it that physical exertion as opposed to the mental concept of
I think that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer that simply and quickly, but and I think you're talking about a slightly different thing. I think we've got quite a lot going on there. If you talk about a sheet of acetate going out to sea, that's kind of time working on it, but you're actually physically taking those out there, and what's coming back?
Sometimes nothing because it's been ripped away, but you know, necessarily going to collect it. It's the kind of physicality of putting it out there and cutting your hands and on wire cables and tying it, and it's that kind of.
What's the work in the end?
It's the trace of the marks that's been made by the elements. You know.
And is that your work?
At the moment,
Okay,
you know,
that's
that's what I'm really interested in. It's find a way in which to present it. You know, either projecting the imagery or transferring the imagery. But it's actually the marks that are important. I'm not making, but it's the labour involved.
Yeah.
I'm interested in.
But it's finding what mediates that action. What I mean by that is, do you project through it? Is the piece of acetate itself the work?
Yeah.
Or is it cut up into 1,000 pieces? And
Well, I like the actual thing more and more, rather than trying to scan it, digitize it, blah blah blah, contact print it in the dark. And that's what I got from more of that immediacy and that labour.
But there's what we spoke about, the kind of concept being embedded in the work. I mean, it's very hard to get away from the concept of your work, isn't it, when you see that? Does that information come across to the viewer when you're looking at this piece of work that it's been out into the sea and back again? So I think sometimes when you see it in a kind of concentrated form like this, you're probably thinking, oh, there's kind of the labour of the kind of whacking of the paper, and then there's the drawing itself, and it's all kind of all in the one piece. I think sometimes it's just the drawing, really, that the frame and the space of the drawing that you see as a viewer. You might detect that there's action kind of gone on because of the way that the marks are made on the paper. But the labour of it, I'm not always needing the labour to be kind of overtly part of the work, if you know what I mean. The fact that I'm physically exhausted after doing 50 films or videos hanging upside down doesn't really come across in the work, but it's something that people ask me about, like that durational aspect and the performance of, you know, of going through that physically is very, very difficult. But the piece, the video or the drawing doesn't necessarily explain that. And I don't know whether I particularly want to put them together too often. Do you know what? Am I being clear?
It's not, I think showing it like this gives it a sort of false sense of quietude in a way.
Right.
Because we haven't heard any of the
sound, yeah.
Or witnessed the videos, because there's actually an incredible amount of violence. It's about containment and control of violence, which a squash court is a very good metaphor for. That you literally have this room that contains this, high velocity ball, but even in the psychological aspects of like, let me down, don't let me down, that kind of interdependence is a very tense and stressful kind of thing to witness.
Yes, I mean it may. Sorry, you were going to say something too as well.
Yes, I was going to liken it to Agnieszka's work. There was some debate at one bit whether to show your film or not at all, and it was kind of like there were similar issues there, I thought, with what you were just saying.
Yes.
That was all the explanation sort of thing, because the film in a way explains it to some degree. And I think it's right that you see it, but after you've seen the boxes. But with yours, if we haven't got the sound and the other things, then there's less of an explanation. Seeing the quiet pictures, which is what you were saying.
Yeah. But I think what Fiona's just said there with this kind of psychological kind of side of things, which is the kind of viewer coming to the work, I think that is very important, that we have more than just the thing in front of us. That lends us or gives us information which works on our psyches, whether that's a kind of myth-making thing or whether that's a kind of real thing in terms of performance and duration. Those work with the piece, whatever that piece is, to deepen it, I suppose, deepen the meaning of it. So what you're saying about Agnieszka's work is true, I think. If you didn't have the film, the video, and no explanation, maybe that what would that do to the work? You know, when you're seeing, I mean, what I was totally surprised by was opening the boxes and the smell coming out. It's amazing. So that is a kind of another facet to engagement of the viewer with the work. The smell, the taste, whether you can jump into the skin of the maker and imagine that, you know, when you're at sea, your hands, all the kind of the wetness, the cold, those kinds of things, are they in that sheet of acetate? You know, does that come across? Does it need to come across?
I think it's the strength of the work. It
Okay.
should come across. And then it's ancillary, is that word, the documentation is very important. They have to start trying to strap the camcorders to the fish boxes, the acetates, attached to the raw metal and record it. Is it
Because you're thinking about that, a soundtrack for that, but without the visual, and then the work itself might work in a better way without giving all the information. Or
it's just like interesting to see a lot of viewers. You're making work for the viewer to understand.
And this is it. We have to be objective and subjective as makers. And sometimes you have to stand outside yourself and analyse what's in front of you and say, okay, no, that's too much. This is just an illustration of what I'm doing. Or no, this is an intrinsic part of the meaning of the piece. Those are very difficult things sometimes. It's good to join with others to kind of discuss that and kind of think about that for yourself or with your work, you know.
But how important is it to you when you put work in on public display that there is a communication of the meaning? I mean, people will take different things from what they see, but is it important for you that some meaning is communicated sort of unambiguously or but not overdone, not done in a way that blows the poetry?
Do we ultimately have control over what anyone thinks about our work? We don't really, do we?
We don't.
People come, you know, they've just had an argument or a sandwich or too many beers. People are coming to the space and the place with all different attitudes and engagements, so it's hard to kind of control that. But within the frame of what you put out, you have to be responsible and sure that that's what you see and that's only what you see. Strip it down to the right things and then you say, okay, that's how far can you can't go any further than that, can you? You're in control to a certain extent, and then after that it's up to the world outside and the viewers who see it and the discussion that comes from it. It lives and breathes in a different way. I mean, that's quite interesting to think about paper in relation to live or presentness, as opposed to the past, or maybe not the future, but this, when we're talking about action and the moment and the present, you kind of relive that when you see a piece. If you're talking about acetate that's been worked on, you're sort of reliving that. It becomes present. more than maybe a drawing of something, an illustration of something. Maybe that's slipping more into the past of something. So maybe we can think about paper in terms of the present and the past.
Do you mean in the sense that the paper might be changing all the time? It might be reacting to...
Maybe it's alive.
I mean, it does respond to humidity, for example, or heat. I mean, it's a responsive medium. But if you encased it in glass, say,
then does that give a kind of screen? Sometimes, you know, it's impossible. You know, you kind of
surprising all that. It seems like it's separating the means by which you're making drawings or the trace of the actions, and separating that as the as it's just on face value of what the viewer engages with, and then separating this other side of it, and especially just to pick up on viewing, because they're made in with a very specific action. You describe them as thwacks on a large stick. I mean, it's kind of analogous to whipping or beating and all of these actions. And it seemed a very strange thing then to kind of separate it into, as something that is purely aestheticized. It seemed quite an odd decision to me. I mean, especially when we're talking about that in view and of meaning, because I think as a viewer approaching it, you do want to search for clues within.
Yes. I mean, they're not always separated. They very often have a wall in between. So if there's an opportunity to split a room into two, there's often sound in one space and a quietness in the other. So there may be marks or something where there's no sound. In the room next door, there's a lot of sound, and sometimes very loud sound, which you might get through the wall or the door. So it's hard sitting here in a way to try and get that across, but it works on the viewer, let's say, so you do have that information coming actually. Of course, there are situations where it's just the drawing that's been made by whacking. But that's what we're talking about, is what you know, does that come across? I don't think I would put a tape or a CD of the sound next to the drawing. I don't think I would do that. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, it's, yeah, where, but what information do you give?
But does this sort of bring up the importance of title in works where you've actually got these black drawings, which in a way quite succinctly expresses how a mark is being made, not necessarily why or what the sort of wider meanings that might be, but it's sort of quite present in the title of the actual action of this.
That is an opportunity to give information, a title. I do like to give a title. You'll all be thinking about titles that give maybe a hook. Maybe that's a way to think about it, rather than being a literal explanation of something. Give the viewer some hooks, some opportunities to jump into the work that kind of steer but don't control. How can you control? But a title is one.
Talking about control, how much are you interested in making work outdoors that deteriorates, like a piece that was, like the rain coming down or anything like that? Is that something you're really, interested in kind of working with the own sort of working?
To a certain extent. I mean, I'm not someone who usually makes things to the point where they decay completely and disappear. It's not really part of the work, I don't think. Same way in the video or the sound, there is a framing of it. It's not quite at the beginning the frame starts, it's not quite at the end. So that work where the charcoal's outside I didn't know what was going to happen here, but I took a risk, I suppose, but not, it wasn't about decay and deterioration. Neither was the bed. The bed, four-poster bed at Cragside, was out for 6 months. What's odd is that kind of created it had a crust that develops on the outside with the rain and the sun. I thought it would completely disappear and disintegrate, but actually it creates a kind of crust. And the colour fades a little bit, but not that much. If you left it out for 2 decades, it would disappear, or it would. So, you know, that's a question for the individual, I think, how much, you know, whether that is part of the work or not.
You know, the column that was there with the bounce.
Yeah.
Was that done? Were those marks done within the space?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was sort of thinking about if there's any interest for you in the stuff that doesn't make it, the charcoal that doesn't stick or that is bounced off. You know, was that left in the space? Was that sort of?
Yeah, it was.
Like,
yeah, there's not much of it though.
Oh, right.
But it was left at the base of the column, and I suppose people probably weren't meant to, but they kind of brushed their hand and a bit came off, although it was fixed. I don't think that was a big part of it. You know, you could make drawings like that. I guess I cleared up when the 2000 wax. You know, I kind of cleared the expressed charcoal away, and you just end up with this drawing. So that's okay. That's, yeah, I didn't keep all the bits and pieces, but I've done other drawings where I've dug into books with chisels. So I've been looking for words. So I'm looking in dictionaries for words, or in the Bible, I'm looking for the word God. And you know, you dig until you find that word. So there's lots of paper that comes out of there, and I gather that up, and it's shown. But it's hard to know how to deal with that stuff for me. I don't know, have you got any ideas how to deal with that? Whether you leave it or not?
I used part of that in my show, because I've been using smudges on the wall and was sanding it back, and the residue was then left, because that kind of looked as though it was illuminating the wall for me.
What if it then moves? If I say I'd like to buy that piece, but would like to show it in this other space?
Yeah, well, it would have to be remade in the other space. It would be another, because part of the work is being embedded in the wall all the time while I'm making it. Because I'm either sanding or repainting or
okay.
Or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important part for some more than others, yeah.
But that was mainly because it was white and it was reflecting, whereas your charcoal is what you have a different.
Yeah.
I think sort of, this is a rather separate point, but I'm just kind of really remembering, and I'm sure people who were at last week's session, this discussion between Keith and Sandra, and the importance of the sound of the scratching of the charcoal as they were discussing. So obviously you had the sound of their voices and then the sound of the scratching of the charcoal. And I'm just kind of now looking at the drawing as it sort of sits in the studio and thinking something is really lost because we can't still experience that kind of activity and the sound that went on during that period of time. And it, in a way, it brings me to sort of think about some of the works that you've shown, Colin, that I was really mindful that there were no kind of images of you actually performing, making the work, and there was no footage. And you said, you know, you did video, but you know, don't often show footage of you hanging upside down. And I'm just kind of wondering about that relationship between performance and then what's left as a trace of that performance. Because for me, this was a kind of trace of the performance. This wasn't the main part of the performance last week. I don't know if other people agree or disagree, but for me what was far more powerful was the fact that it was being made at a certain point in time and kind of evolved, but there was these other activities going on. It felt like there was this kind of wall where this sound was going through the drawing, and it was so much more than just looking at the drawing for me. And I just wondered how you felt about that kind of sense of the moment, and were these traces of an activity, or are these really what you feel is most important, this is what you move towards to achieve?
I think it's difficult in a way because some of my work is sound and video itself. So the medium, I'm thinking about the medium, making a video piece. So it's framed within either a monitor or projection. And it's slightly muddied in a way because I'm performing as well sometimes in these videos. And there's obviously much more footage than you actually see, or that you hear. So there's a work that I've made where I hang upside down and record or speak out a Samuel Beckett play, so Not I, which is a 22-minute monologue, which is spoken very, very quickly upside down. All the piece is just a sound of that voice, but it sounds very, very strange, and it's very, very strange, and I'm having to kind of push the words out. But I don't think you would put the video of it happening next to the piece. It just wouldn't make sense, sort of thing. With the drawing, I mean, that's a special situation in a way because it's come about through a seminar program, and if that was a piece, would you have the sound of it happening? I mean, I'm with you, I'm right there with the sound of the charcoal when he's describing that, and that would add, it has added something. Actually, I think it's added more you explaining that to me than actually if I heard the sound of it going on at the time.
What is the work in the action and the doing of it and the sound itself when it was happening, or is that the work? Because what you've done is display the final result, but you've removed the doing of it.
Yeah, well, I think all we can say is that sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, depending on the artist, or there's durational work where it's very important. I mean, we've been to performances where, I don't know, Abramovich and Ulay performance, where the duration is absolutely necessary to the piece. I went to one of hers where she had 4 snakes on her head and ice blocks around the gallery, and she was sitting motionless, so we were there for 3-4 hours. The 2 snakes fell off her head eventually onto the floor and then went through the ice blocks, and at that moment the audience just went poof, it's like and the tension was kind of lost in a way, but the tension that was created there for that time up until then absolutely needed that duration. The duration was part of it. So maybe tension is a word that's quite oblique, but you need to think about that in relation to your own practice. The tension of all these elements together. You don't want that to become flaccid. So if you start to illustrate these things, it becomes, it's like, I didn't want to know that, or that doesn't help it particularly. You want to create tension with your work. So all the elements that you have in there need to be in there, and they're bound. So, and it's down to the individual, whether the markings of the charcoal dropping away, or the sound, or the other elements, or the video of it happening. Sometimes it's documentary stuff, sometimes it's important information. That's up to you to kind of muscle that out of the work.
I like that privacy, that intensity that you're doing it privately rather than you need. Have you ever, like just me as a private person, mortifying? You know what I mean? It's just me.
I've got faith that it's all coming out in the work itself.
Yeah.
You don't need to see, we don't need to see that stuff. It's going to be there in the piece. Yeah.